My name is Kevin, and I am Persian. I'm Nasrin's son, but I was born and raised in Chicago.
I'm Darlene. I was born and raised in Wisconsin, just outside of Milwaukee. I live in San Diego, in the Rancho Penasquitos neighborhood. So between here and SDSU is where I am.
My name is Russell. I'm a native Californian, raised up and down the West Coast.
My name is Dave. I originally come from Boston, Mass. I moved out here a year ago. And up until 3 weeks ago, I will be honest, I never heard of the religion or the word Baha'i.
Wow.
Not one word.
I'm Safa, and I was born and grew up in Iran, Tehran. And it's almost 1.5 years that I moved to San Diego.
From where?
From Malaysia.
From Malaysia.
My name is Aryan. I'm from Iran. I born in Tehran, but I grew up in Shiraz. And then I moved to San Diego like 8 years ago. I moved to US like 15 years ago, but moved to San Diego for my work. And I really love nature here in San Diego. I like it.
I'm Steve. I was born in New York, raised in Chicago, born Jewish, and became a Baha'i a little over 7 years ago. First heard about it when I was in college and got right on it right away and became a Baha'i for 29 years.
It must mean you did a deep dive.
It just means I waited a while to do my deep dive.
Okay, that's good. Well, it's so wonderful to have everybody gathered together. You know, this kind of a gathering of friends who have dinner together and chat about the Baha'i faith and other spiritual topics. It happens all the time. It's been going on for, 175 years almost. So this is a pretty normal thing. This is how Baha'is gather, and this is how we talk about our faith with others and enjoy each other's company and build community. So I remember that those two young ones in the corner were in a children's class that I was doing in City Heights quite a few years ago now.
Oh my goodness, you know this.
So they probably weren't sure when they looked at me, is that really her? But I looked at them and I knew that. Yeah. So it's a small world that we're somehow so connected. I heard so many things that kind of brought us together. You know, the world is wonderful that way today. So without further ado, do we want to have the devotions first and then we'll let Steve share a few things, and it will, I'm sure, be open to questions and answers, because that seems to be the way that he's been chatting all evening already. So, Ariana, if you want to get us ready?
We're gonna have the just short devotional, just to pray. Yes.
So let me, I think, talk a little bit about the most important, one of the most important concepts of Baha'i faith, besides independent investigation of truth, is progressive revelation. So I'm going to give you kind of my version of progressive revelation. Stop me if I'm boring you. But essentially, the idea of progressive revelation puts aside this idea of warring religions and instead focuses us on one God. And this one God is sending messengers in every age. So instead of the God of Jesus and the God of Moses and the God of Muhammad, there's just God. There's no God but Allah, says the Quran. There's one true God, John 17:3 in the Christian Bible. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. In every religion, even Buddha gets into the action. Buddha says there is an unborn, an uncreated, an unmade. And without this unborn, uncreated, unmade, we, the born, the created, the made, could never exist. So he's talking about the one God, just a little differently. All the messengers talk about this one God, Why not the same one God? Why would Buddha have a different God than Jesus or Muhammad or Moses? And so the Baha'i faith says there is just one God. Call God whatever name, and that God has sent messengers. 5,000 years ago, he sends Krishna. 4,000 years ago, Abraham. 3,500 years ago, Moses. 3,000 years ago, Zoroaster, and so on and so forth. There's two parts to the message. The first part is what Jesus Christ said in Calvin. Does anyone know the two most important commandments according to the Christian Bible? They're also the two most important things of any. Do you know?
Love your neighbor.
Love your neighbor and love God. And that's what Muhammad taught too. That's what Buddha taught, that's what Moses taught. In fact, when Jesus said it, he was quoting Moses. So they all taught this. Sometimes we don't do it in their names. The other part of what they teach that's really the spiritual teachings. It's really compassion, mercy, love, kindness, truth, justice. That's taught by all the messengers. The other part is the social laws and teachings for each age. And what Baha'u'llah says is be anxiously concerned for the needs of your age, for humanity's needs in your age. So each age, he says, has a different need. Humanity has different needs. And each messenger is a divine position for their age. The first part being love God and love man, for the spiritual teachings, which are the same in all the religions. But the social laws and teachings are different based on the needs of the age. So we're going back to Abraham 4,000 years ago. And most of you might have heard this story. God says to Abraham, go kill your son. From a Muslim perspective, that son is Ishmael. From a Christian and Jewish perspective, that son is Isaac. We won't argue about that. That's a fight for another day. But the story is the same in all other ways. God tells Abraham to kill his son. He loyally ties up his son, and he's ready to kill his son, and then God sends a ram, and in the 11th hour, he catches the ram, and he kills the ram instead. And my question to anyone here is why? Why did God ask Abraham to kill his only son? What was he trying to prove?
Testing him.
Testing him? Maybe he's testing his faith? Is that what you're saying? Okay, so does anyone else think that's a good answer? I think that's a good answer. So I have a son, as I said earlier, named David. He goes to San Diego State. Fortunately, he's built kind of like Kevin now, so I couldn't do this. He's 19 years old, but let's say he was still small enough, like your size maybe, and I could tie him up. But back 4,000 years ago, when Abraham was teaching, it was a common thing. And so if we look at that story in context, actually child sacrifice was quite common. And so that story is not really so much about child sacrifice as much as the end of child sacrifice and the beginning of animal sacrifice, which Moses 500 years later codifies. And then 2,000 years after Abraham comes Jesus. Jesus says, I'm the Paschal animal, and he sacrifices himself, and that's the end of animal sacrifice. What's interesting is it's 40 years after, just 40 short years after he does this, the temple is destroyed, the Jewish temple where they sacrificed the animal. So if you ask a Jewish person today, I was raised Jewish, I did ask my parents, I said, Mom and Dad, why don't we sacrifice animals anymore? They said, because the temple was destroyed. They never said because Jesus said, I'm the Paschal Lamb, and sacrificed himself. So when the messenger does these things in every age, when they teach their social laws and teachings for that age, it goes through the whole universe, to everyone on earth, because they're universal. And sometimes people know the message, but not the messenger. So sometimes when they hear the message, they're like, oh yeah, that's logical. It's because it's spread. When the messenger originally gives the messenger its message, it's always radical, because it's at the inauguration of the age, and so people haven't got the message yet. Over time, the message spreads and spreads and spreads. And so it did with Jesus, it did it with Moses, did it with Zoroaster, all the messengers. And there's actually a lot of evidence. So if we look backwards in the past, one of the questions Dave and I were discussing is how to recognize a messenger. Well, it's super easy to do it if you go back in the past. Same pattern every time. The messenger comes, the messenger leads an exemplary life, the messenger suffers, always at the hands of the previous religious leaders who don't want to lose their power, and then the messenger triumphs. Maybe not the messenger themselves, but their followers. And the messenger leaves in their wake always a great and glorious golden age. In the case of Moses, he suffers, he's chased out of Egypt along with his people, and in his wake comes the great kingdom of Israel, the greatest kingdom of its age at the time, went on for centuries. These slaves very improbably come out of Egypt and create this. Of course, they're following Moses. It's really in the spirit of Moses that they do this. The next one, 500 years later, is Zoroaster, 3,000 years ago. Zoroaster comes in Persia. They try to kill him. The priests do 3 times. They put him in jail. He survives, the king adopts his faith. Voila, what comes in his wake? A great golden age which lasts for 1,000 years. You had a great empire which lasts for 1,000 years, which is the heart of the Zoroastrian golden age. Does anyone know the name of that empire? Where do you guys come from? The Persian Empire, very good. The Persian Empire, the heart of the Zoroastrian golden age. The next one is Buddha, 500 years later. He comes, he suffers, and in his wake comes a great empire, the Maurya Empire, which is a vast Buddhist empire. It eventually grows to encompass over 2 million square miles. Why? Because Buddha's given the perfect laws and the perfect teachings at the perfect time. And when people turn to them, they thrive. It's the same thing. So it was the greatest empire of its day, the greatest empire of the age before was the Persian Empire. The next one to come is Jesus. Jesus comes, and he of course, is sacrificed after just 3 years. He's crucified after 3 years of ministry. There was a dozen messiahs, Christ, sacrificed at that time. The authorities thought that this would come to nothing. It sacrificed 11 others. Who cares? Just one more. And he wasn't even the most popular. Is that what happened? Did they wipe out Christianity? No, they did not.
Oh, they did.
So what happens is the disciples go far and wide, and they spread this beautiful teachings. And Christians were known as pillars of morality in the early days of Christianity, which made it so attractive, and the religion grew like wildfire. Even though the Christians were mercilessly attacked, just like Jesus, they were literally thrown to the lions. Many terrible things were done to the Christians, but their religion grew and grew. And eventually, as promised, Jesus took over the Roman Empire, became the Holy Roman Empire. And actually the heart of the great Christian golden age that followed was really the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, and that lasted for over 1,000 years. This great Christian empire running on the teachings of Jesus. Next comes Muhammad. 600 years after Jesus, Muhammad comes to a place that's so terrible that they're burying their daughters alive. And the reason they're doing this is because men are killing each other so fast in war that women have become expendable. Muhammad says, he starts teaching love and kindness and mercy and compassion and justice and unity. These divided people that were so warlike that they were killing each other left and right, they unite. I mean, they don't totally get rid of the war, but they unite across all of Arabia. He unites all the way to Persia, all the way across northern Africa, all the way to Spain, and he creates in his wake the golden age of Islam, the first caliphate, the greatest empire by far of its age, the light of the world for hundreds of years, for 500 years. Does anyone know anything they invented? One thing they invented?
Your name is one
What's
of
that?
them.
The wheel. I don't think so.
You don't think so?
I think it was
It
before
was
that.
Romans?
I think it was before the Muslims. But I'll tell you that some things they did invent. Algebra, they all sound like algebra and algorithm.
Also,
They did a lot.
astronomy.
They did a lot with this. They don't think they invented astronomy, but
No,
they did a lot
but I
with
mean,
it.
they did a
They
lot.
did a lot with astronomy and architecture. And another thing they invented was alchemy. And they also invented surgical instruments, and they also had the very first university, which is very big, a college. All these sound like Arabic Muslim words because they are. So they really contribute a lot. In fact, during this Muslim golden age, Christianity, if we look at Western Europe, has fallen into the Dark Ages. So if we look at these messengers as having a torch, like an Olympic relay, pass torch to torch to torch, when the Christians fall into the Dark Ages, the people with the torch are the Muslims, and more specifically the Muslim Moors, who take over Spain for over 600 years. And they bring this incredible Muslim know-how into Spain, and it filters into Europe. And it's a huge part of what becomes known as the Renaissance. So they really help create the Renaissance. The Muslim know-how helps with the Renaissance. Also, the fall of Constantinople helped as well, because from the Christian Empire, they moved over to Europe, to Western Europe. So, the Renaissance, with the Renaissance, Christianity is lifted out of the Dark Ages, and Christians conquer virtually the whole world. They conquer Africa, most of Africa, North America, South America, most of Asia, Australia. And we get to the mid-1800s, Islam has now fallen from its golden age, just like the Christian golden age ended, and the Buddhist one, and the Jewish one. They get old. In the 1840s, there's now 3 religions expecting something really big, maybe more, but there's 3 I know about. The Jews, the Christians, and the Muslims. The Jews are expecting the Messiah. the Christ. They're expecting him to come for the first time in 1840, based on the book the Zohar, their book of mysticism. And they think three things are going to happen. That the Messiah is going to come, they're going to go back to Israel, or the Holy Land, and there's going to be a technological revolution. Well, we know the Jews didn't see the Messiah in 1840, so we'll get that out of the way. Have the Jews got to go back to Israel? Anybody? Did the Jews get to go back to Israel? What do you think?
Probably. Yes.
We say yes. When? They thought it was going to be 1840.
1949, 47.
48 is the most common answer. And 48 is when they get the partition after World War II. These are the most common answers. The actual correct answer, that's a partially correct answer. The actual most correct answer is 1844. 1844 is the Ottoman Edict of Toleration. That allows the Jews to start going back. So they start going back almost immediately. By 1859, Jerusalem is majority Jewish. By 1948, there was over 600,000 Jews there, and now there's about 7 million Jews in modern-day Israel. So they got the country, they've got 7 million Jews living there. Absolutely, the Jews got to go back, and it starts in 1844, almost right on time. If we look at that same time, 1844, and we ask about inventions, well, has there been a technological, raise your hand if you think there's been a technological revolution since 1844. Biggest one in history. 75% of the inventions in the history of the world have happened since 1844. So what kind of things have happened? Well, of course, the lights we see, the cameras we see, the computers, the phones, even things like plastic, or even these types of materials in our shirts are all new since 1844. Probably your sunglasses even have some plastic in them, I would guess.
Yeah.
The plastic water bottle, things that we don't think about, the TV.
Glass clothing got popular.
Let me show you something, and sit down, this is going to be really shocking to you. These did not exist in 1844.
I know.
And they didn't even exist when I was your age. That's how old I am.
My teachers say that too.
That's true. It's actually true. So the Jews get the technological revolution, but they don't see the Messiah, so we move on to the Christians. Now, what are Christians expecting in the 1840s all over the world? In Germany, in France, in Scandinavia, in Switzerland, in Holland, England, America. A guy named Joseph Wolf, who goes all over the Middle East, including every major future famous Baha'i site in Persia. What are they all saying is going to happen?
Christ is going to reappear.
Christ is going to come back and the world's going to end. This is the great Adventist period. It's all over the world. Now, who's saying this? Martin Luther. He predicts from 300 years earlier, by 1840. John Wesley and the Methodists, 1836. One of the big ones in America, Joseph Smith, the Mormons. He's predicting all the time the imminent return of Christ. A woman named Harriet Livermore gets in front of Congress in 1843, and she announces from the seat of the Speaker of the House that Christ is going to return imminently. But the biggest one of all in America is William Miller. He's a farmer. In 1831, he announces to his family that Christ will return in 1844. He's got all the Bible signs, specifically Daniel 8:14, the 2300-day prophecy. He's got it all figured out that in 2300 days the temple will be cleansed, the sanctuary will be cleansed. It starts at 457 BC when the temple was rebuilt by the order of Zoroastrians, by the way, giving Zoroaster his due, Zoroastrian kings. He has 2300 years, gets to 1844. Now, Miller's waiting with 100,000 followers in 1844. They're all waiting for the world to end all over the Northeast United States on October 22nd, 1844. Let's see. Did the world end on October 22nd,
We're still here.
We're still here, which is how they knew on October 23rd, 1844 was the great disappointment. What was the problem? Miller, the rest of his life, could never figure it out. He checked his calculations again and again, and he said, I thought it was right, I can't figure out where I was wrong. He just couldn't figure out where he was wrong. Miller wasn't wrong. It was the Bible that was wrong. The Bible had an error. And it wasn't with the date. The error was the end of the world. Miller was looking for the end of the world because the Bible at the time, the King James Bible, said the end of the world in several places. All those Bibles, the newer Bibles, in those same places, say end of the age. They had mistranslated a single word. So Miller should not have been looking for the end of the world. He should have been looking for the end of the age. All of the Adventists who were looking for the end of the world, they were disappointed because the world didn't end. And they were right, the world didn't end, but that's not what the Bible had said.
What do you think of that?
What's that?
Wouldn't you be glad the world?
But they would protect.
But they didn't know. See, they thought, they just wanted Christ to return. They thought he was going to come back at the end of the world. So they thought, well, it's really great, the world's going to end, but we get Christ back, and they were happy about it. But they didn't know that the Bible was wrong. We know now today, but what's interesting today is we're not in the Adventist period anymore. If they had known that then, we might have had some different results. But anyway, the Christians don't recognize Christ in all those countries I mentioned. Hundreds of thousands of Christians are disappointed. So we move on to the Muslims. One other thing about the Christian Bible before I leave the Christian Bible. Christian Bible in the book of Revelation, 7 times, and in the book of Daniel 3 times mentions the number 1260, a total of 10 times, 10 separate verses, the number 1260. Does anybody here, we'll just stick to Christian, not Baha'is, does anyone know what 1260 means? Muslim or Christian? Does anyone know what 1260 means? Christians won't, so don't feel bad. 1260 doesn't mean much to Christians. And actually what's really interesting is this Christian Bible, which was written 600 years before Muhammad, is talking about a Muslim year. Because it's in the Muslim year 1260 that Persia is lit on fire. The reason is Muhammad's chosen successor was Ali. And Ali was the first Imam. Ali is killed, and they kill the next 11 Imams, and the 12th Imam disappears in 260 of Muslim years. And he's supposed to reappear 1,000 years later. What year is that? 1260. So it's in 1260 in Persia that almost all of Persia is expecting the 12th Imam to reappear. Now, what year is that in Christian years? I'll give you a hint. I've said it a few times, many times. What do you think? 18 what? I heard an 18? 1844. 1844. It's the exact same year Miller has come to, only Miller didn't know about 1260. Miller had no idea, didn't know anything about Islam. But had he known, he would have said, oh wow, they're looking at the same time. But the internet didn't exist, phones didn't exist. So Miller had no idea that halfway across the world, the Muslims were looking for exactly the same year. They were looking for a different name. They were looking for the 12th Imam. Most people in Persia at that time were waiting for a 1,000-year-old man to come out of hiding. You've probably heard that, right? That the 12th Imam is supposed to come out of hiding. You come from Shia?
Yes.
So Shia Muslims, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but Shia Muslims, they expect that the 12th Imam will come out of hiding. Some people think he's going to come out of a well. That's never going to happen. And the reason it's never going to happen is because people don't live to be 1,000 years old, or now it's almost 1,200 years old. So that expectation could never have come true. But there was a group called the Shakis, and the Shakis expected that a young man would come between 20 and 30 years old, and a descendant of Muhammad. And so a young man does come by the name of the Bab, who gets all their expectations. He doesn't smoke, he's a descendant of Muhammad, he's incredibly learned without any teaching, everything they expected. And he announces on May 23rd, actually the evening of May 22nd, 1844, that he is the promised one of Islam, 12th Imam Mahdi, the guiding one. The very next day, May 24th, 1844, the very first telegram, "What hath God wrought?" is sent by Samuel Morse, talking about a messenger of God, the start of that technological revolution. Now, meanwhile, the Bab is teaching this new faith, and it lights Persia on fire. This is very scary. The king is a little concerned, the Shah, so he sends his most trusted religious scholar, his name is Vahid, with a sword to kill him if he isn't who he says he is. Vahid publicly vows before he goes that he will kill the Bab if he isn't who he says he is. He goes very confidently, spends 45 minutes pontificating to the Bab, telling him how great he is, and then the Bab starts talking. They end up meeting 3 times. The third time they meet, the Bab reveals right in front of Vahid the equivalent of 1/3 of the Quran. Hour after hour. It's like a waterfall. How can you recognize a messenger of God? No one could do this. Not even Stephen King, the celebrated novelist who writes about a novel every week. Yeah, not really, but Stephen King could probably write an entire novel in a month or 2. The Bab wrote a novel in a night. He wrote equivalent of 1/3 of the Quran. And not only did he reveal it, it was all new revelation, it was glorious and perfect. And Vahid looked at this and said, if all the powers on earth were leagued against me, I would not abandon my confidence in this cause. Vahid was a changed man. He never went back to the Shah. He wrote to the Shah and told him this, and he said, and 5 years later he gave his life in service of the Bab. 400 other religious scholars became followers, 100,000 followers, and now the mullahs of Persia had a serious problem. You see, the mullahs of Persia don't exist. In Shia Islam has no clergy. They've only arisen over these centuries, and they've done it out of the goodness of their hearts, some of them have actually, to help the people, because the 12th Imam had not come, so they were experts on the religion. They were just going to help temporarily until the 12th Imam came. Everything in Shia Islam, right, revolves around the 12th Imam. So as soon as the 12th Imam comes, the very second it comes, of course they'll give up all their power, is what they promised. So now they have a guy with 100,000 followers. And by the way, they've got 100,000 followers, he's got 400 religious scholars, and they have to choose what they want to do. Do they want to accept him and give up all their power, or do they put him in jail? Anybody, what do you think they did?
Accept.
Accept is a wonderful thing. Who said accept? It's a wonderful thing. It's what you would do, but unfortunately, we've got to go back to the story and look at what the religious leaders have done throughout history.
Power hungry.
So they did not accept him. They put him in jail. But the jailer became a believer. So they put him in another jail. That jailer essentially became a believer. They put him on trial. They're running out of options. Who are you? I am, the promised one you've been expecting for 1,000 years. He says this knowing he's going to be killed for saying it. But he was a messenger of God. He didn't mince words. He never, ever stood back. He was always very forward, very confident, but in a modest way, incredibly humble and modest, not in an arrogant way. Messengers of God are so unique in the way they approach the world. Both the Bab and well, we'll talk about this later, but when the troops were coming for the Bab, it's very scary. It's a very vicious time. They would literally tear people limb from limb. When the troops were coming from, the Bab met them on the road. He went back to them, shocked them, and then led them to the town he was being taken to in front of them, because that's a messenger of God. Human beings don't do that, but messengers of God do. So the Bab is arrested. He's already been arrested. Now he's going to be killed because he's claimed to be the promised one. So they go to take him out of his cell. The Bab says, "I'm sorry, no earthly force can take me until I'm ready to go. I've got to finish my mission. I'm talking to my secretary." They take him anyway. They suspend him from a wall in front of a crowd of thousands of people in Tabriz, Persia, July 9th, 1850. They tie up Anis, a young man who wants to be killed with them. They shoot them approximately 750 times with rifles in front of a crowd of thousands of people at the main public square in Tabriz, Persia. And we know the result. So, the question is, anyone who doesn't know the answer already, was he dead or alive? Said he couldn't be killed, but they did shoot at him 750 times with rifles at close range. And we know what happened because we had a lot of witnesses, and they're all consistent. Do you know what happened? What do you think?
Sure. He died.
Died is a good. Anyone? What do you think?
Obviously, he wasn't killed. Especially with witnesses.
Yeah, we wouldn't be talking about it if he was killed this many years later. He was not killed. So, when the smoke finally cleared Anis, his follower was standing there unharmed and smiling, and the Bab had disappeared. He was not even there at all. So they did a frantic search, and they finally find him back in his cell, finishing his mission, which is what he said he needed to do. He finishes it. He says, "I'm done now. Now you can kill me." So they take him and they tie him up again. They tie up Anis again. Sam Khan, the executioner, who was Armenian Christian, pulls his regiment and says, "Never again," which makes sense because what he'd seen was pretty incredible. And they got a second regiment, and that second regiment shoots and kills Anis and the Bab. And they don't stop there. By the way, when this happened, it went dark in the middle of the day. It was a sandstorm. So they didn't stop there. They'd been killing his followers already. By 1852, 2 years later, over 20,000 of his followers lay dead, often in terrible circumstances. Now there was only two leaders left, a woman and a man, two of the main leaders. The woman was Tahirih. Tahirih pulls off her veil in 1848. First main meeting of the Bab's followers. And she says, this is a new age and a new faith. And she says new rules for all of humanity. And one of those new rules in 1848 Persia is that women will now be equal to men, fully equal to men. This was radical. This is at a time in Persia where you couldn't even stand in a woman's shadow. Tahrir is pulling her veil off, which you never would do as a woman in public. She does it, and she announces this. Just days after Tahrir does this, in Seneca Falls, New York, comes the very famous Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention. So this, again, this happens all over the world simultaneously. Meanwhile, back in Persia, Tahrir is teaching this new faith from behind a curtain. She embarrasses the male professors who dare to speak or try to debate against her, the male scholars. Although Tahrir is now in great danger, so the king offers to save her life as they're killing all the leaders. She says, no, you keep your religion, I'll keep mine. She keeps going. She's also quite beautiful. Eventually, they do arrest her. She puts on her wedding dress. She looks her killers in the eye. She says, you can kill me as soon as you like, but you cannot stop the emancipation of women. And so that goes on until this very day. That leaves one more leader left, the very last one. He is a nobleman, the son of one of the wealthiest noblemen in Persia. His name is Baha'u'llah. That's the glory of God. His dad is a great nobleman and a provincial governor, very well respected. Baha'u'llah, by the time he's, how old are you again?
Me?
Okay, by the time he's your age, 13 years old. What's that, 12? 12 or 13, right around your age. All the leaders in town are gathered around him asking him questions, just like Jesus Christ. So they're all the messengers of God are known for innate wisdom. Baha'u'llah was as well. By his early 20s, he's known as the father of the poor because he's very, very kind to the poor. He becomes a follower of the Bab. In his mid-20s, becomes a great leader in the cause. And in 1852, he's the last one standing. So they arrest him. They torture him. They put 100-pound chains on his shoulders. They drag him off through the streets to a great, terrible prison called the Black Pit, 3 stories underground. And it's in the Black Pit that Baha'u'llah sees the vision of a maiden. The maiden says, you're the promised one of all faiths. So for Hindus, the 10th avatar. For Buddhists, the 5th Buddha. And for Jews, the Messiah. And for Zoroastrians, he'd be called the Shah Baran. Different names for different religions. For both Christians and Muslims, he would be called Christ returned. Isa returned. So he's, according to the Muslim expectation, going to reign for 40 years. He does, from 1852 to 1892, and reveals the equivalent of 100 Qurans, 60 Christian Bibles. His message, in a nutshell, it's hard to take 60 Christian Bibles and condense it down, but essentially is this. I've come with the most great peace. I've come for all humanity, people of all faiths and no faiths. And I've come with this most great peace. We get it when we understand we're one human family. So get rid of sexism, extremely radical at that time. Get rid of racism, we're one human race. No one thought that. That went against the proven science of his day. Not today, but back then. He said that the earth is but one country, mankind and citizens. Very hard to imagine back in the mid-1800s before phones and the internet and all that, planes. People didn't think that back then. Some people don't think that now. A lot of people still aren't there. Baha'u'llah, like all the messengers, was way ahead of his time. And the biggest thing of all is that all these great religions that are fighting each other like cats and dogs for thousands of years, he says they're one. Islam and Christianity and Judaism and Buddhism are just chapters in one beautiful, eternal faith of God. And each one of these beautiful and distinct chapters should be celebrated, not fought against. We should celebrate both Buddhism. We should celebrate Islam. We should celebrate Christianity. And celebrating Christianity doesn't mean you can't also celebrate Islam. And celebrating Islam doesn't mean you can't celebrate the Baha'i faith. He says we only go awry when we hate the other religions, not when we love our own. Much like people. We're supposed to love everybody. He says that's what Jesus Christ was saying. Love thy neighbor. He said it. None of you truly believes unless he wishes for his brother what he wishes for himself. Muhammad. They were all telling us to love each other. And what Baha'u'llah is just doing is reminding us and telling us in more broad terms, in more exact terms, what that means. That means your neighbor from another country. That means your neighbor who's another gender. That means your neighbor who was born into another religion. And that means your neighbor with a little bit different skin color. Your neighbor is your neighbor. Why are we fighting about this? And he says when, not if, when we learn this lesson, we will have world peace. So that's the Baha'i faith, somewhat.
When it comes to the prophets of God, and when you understand the world as a whole, there were inhabitants of every continent.
Yes.
So why does it appear that if you were to spread your hand on the globe, that all the prophets of God only came in this area, as opposed to appearing in South Africa for one? Or spread it across everywhere, North America.
There's nothing to say that there wasn't a prophet in North America. For example, White Buffalo Catherine could have been a prophet of God. She's in North America. She was at least some kind of messenger. So there are messengers everywhere. The messengers I described are not the only messengers. There are probably lesser messengers and greater messengers. But God never leaves us without guidance. The one thing I would say is that that's the central area of the world in some ways, in terms of civilization. And it's been, the prophets tend to go from India towards all the way to Israel and kind of in between. So, and then spread from there. I don't understand, it's beyond my pay grade, but it's my understanding. It's my understanding that God sends prophets to us when and where we need it. And I do believe that God has sent prophets to places like, for example, Native Americans and to the Chinese. For example, what's his name? He did Lao Tse. Is that right? So he could very well be a prophet of God. I'm not saying he definitely is because I haven't studied it, but there's no reason why there wouldn't be a Chinese prophet. In fact, I would think there would be a Chinese prophet, and there would be a South African prophet in other areas. And the Baha'i writings say, as does the Quran. The Quran specifies certain prophets, but says there's been many more. The Baha'i writings are very simple. We don't claim to know all the prophets.
There's also an understanding that at the time of Baha'u'llah, the ones that are mentioned are all still very present in the world.
Yes, that's true.
And especially in that part of the world where his message was blossoming from, all of those were in that vicinity of the world.
Yeah.
And so it made it easy to recognize and acknowledge that they were all part of one God's vision for humanity.
Yes.
So I think that was a big part of it too. But we also know at that time, just thinking about Tahirih, who you mentioned, right? It was so radical for her to take off her veil, but it was also radical for her father to actually allow her to study the Quran and the holy writings, and to be present behind a screen in front of scholars. That was pretty radical, and I don't know that he really understood what he was doing or who she would become as a result.
Her father, this is a very interesting thing. Her father never recognized the Bab. He was not a friend of the Bab. In fact, he was an opponent of the Bab. But her father said something very interesting. He said that if she, Tahirih, would have claimed that she was a messenger of God, he would follow her. So he really adored his daughter. I personally have a daughter like that, so I'd say that, not that I think my daughter's a messenger of God, but I think she's pretty, well, my daughter's brilliant, and
Yeah.
Tahirih was brilliant. I understand as a parent of I'm not saying this, she's just a brilliant child, I don't know where it came from. I can understand how he would think that. So he had great respect for Tahirih, and I think, think about, probably difficult for him, because I think that he was constrained by society just as much as her, and he probably loved and kind of innately knew how brilliant his daughter was, but yet society wouldn't let her be that brilliant.
And many in the world weren't educated to read for themselves, right? Or to even memorize the holy writings. That was left for chosen few at that time in history.
In 1800, the literacy rate worldwide was 12%. Today it's over 85%. So we're in this incredible modern age. I mentioned 75% of the inventions in the history of the world. I kind of touched on women's rights, also civil rights. But literacy is a big thing. One of the things in the Baha'i faith, one of the tenets is universal education. So these sayings, these teachings of Baha'u'llah are going all around the world, and more we can understand the teachings. One of the big things in the Baha'i faith is no clergy, and the reason for that is because we can read. Most of us can read. Any other questions, thoughts, comments?
Not really. I guess if you look at God and everything, now he sent out, after he passed away, he sent out the 12 apostles.
Yes.
To take his word and
Yes.
spread it.
Absolutely.
They did,
And they did.
absolutely.
And that was the word. And he said, I am the life, the truth, and the way. And no one comes to the Father except through me.
Right.
Now, Jesus said that. Why? Because he was Christ. Jesus was the light of the world. Now, when Muhammad came, he said something very similar. He said, I am the way. And Buddha, 500 years before Jesus, said he was the way. Krishna in his day said he was the way. The Bab in his day said he was the way. So what Jesus did, that pattern, the Bab and Baha'u'llah did exactly the same thing. They had disciples. They sent them all over to spread this word. So think of this as cascading word. Jesus, when he came, was the Christ, the word of God. He sent the word all over the world. When Muhammad comes 600 years later, he sends the word all over as well. When the Bab comes, he sends the word all over. And when Baha'u'llah comes, he sends the word all over. And the word is the word. And God is the God. There's the God. Allah, the God. That's what it means. And the God is always the God. The word is always the word. And in my opinion, the Christ is always the Christ.
Yeah.
The Christ, though, is not limited to Jesus. Buddha says, I'm not the first Buddha, I'm not the last. And I would say that would logically mean that Jesus was the next Buddha. And of course, then that would mean also logically that Buddha was a previous Christ. That this Christ spirit comes in every age and through a messenger enlightens and lifts up humanity. And so the pattern happens in every age after age.
Yeah. And Nepal and everything, you get the Dalai Lama and all that. And
But-
some of those,
The Dalai Lama is a wonderful example of a Buddhist.
my gosh, yeah.
And
And
just,
some of them, lived over 100 years old.
well, the Dalai Lama is a modern day Buddhist, and he's bringing the teachings of Buddha. Now, the teachings of Buddha, according to Baha'u'llah, can't solve the problems of the world today. Not because Buddha wasn't perfect, he was. But the teachings of Buddha solved the problems of the world 2,500 years ago, and the fruits of that teaching was the Great Maurya Empire. But the spiritual teachings of Buddha are just as true today as they were 2,500 years ago. And I think the Dalai Lama does an exceptional job bringing those teachings of compassion and love. I think he does that. And so what I would say is that, if you're truly following the spiritual teachings of Moses, and you're a good Jew, or if you're a good Buddhist, or a good Christian, following the spiritual teachings of Jesus, those are just as true today as they were 2,000 years ago or 2,500 years ago. It's the social laws and teachings that we need as well. And that's that combination that lifts up humanity. That's what Baha'u'llah is talking about, is you need both of them to solve the problems of the age. And the big problem of this age is disunity. That's the view.
We're drifting away from this. And look at all the violence in this world. It's terrible.
Well, the violence is due to lack of love.
Yeah.
How could you kill your neighbor if you love your neighbor?
Yeah.
But the one thing I love, this idea of oneness in the Baha'i faith. This idea that we're one human family. If you looked at every problem we have in the world today and said we're one human family, and just started with that. Climate change we were talking about. Well, why is climate change so bad? My wife is on the board of the Sierra Club Foundation, and they're playing whack-a-mole. They're hitting this problem and that problem. It's very stressful because one problem comes and hit the next problem. Because China goes one way, we go another way, India goes another way, and then nothing gets done. We need to, as a globe, and actually the former British Prime Minister said that a year ago with COVID, a year or two ago. He said, we need to get on the same page, and we need world government. We need this global governance for all the major problems, whether it be COVID or climate change, and that's what Baha'u'llah was talking about in the 1800s. And it's not
He
that.
knew it like sooner than what we hear now.
Well, he was God. I mean, essentially, when I say he was God, he wasn't God any more than Jesus was God, and he wasn't any less God than Jesus. Was Jesus God or not? Well, sure. From one perspective, Jesus was God because he was the Word of God. From another perspective, he was simply a man. And he was both at the same time. Same thing with Muhammad. Muhammad was the word of God, so he was God. When he spoke, it was God speaking. But it was coming through the voice, it was coming through a man's voice, from a physical man. So Muhammad physically was only a man, the same thing with Jesus. But when he spoke, it was the word of God. And so when Baha'u'llah spoke, it was the word of God and the knowledge of God. And of course, Baha'u'llah, I mean, some of the things he predicted World War I and World War II in Germany. He said that Germany would suffer in both World War I and World War II. He predicted nuclear power and the dangers of nuclear power before you even had the words. He said the smallest elements would have great power and they could poison the whole atmosphere.
Yeah.
You know, so many things he predicted, and Abdul-Baha's son was the same way. Abdul-Baha came to America in 1912, and he said a tiny spark in the Balkans would light up a great war, and that's exactly what happened 2 years later. And then he said, we mentioned this earlier, he said the Battle of Armageddon was going to happen soon, too. He predicted that. The Battle of Armageddon did happen in 1918. Literally called the Battle of Armageddon.
Can you talk about the power of disintegration and integration and how?
So what's happening in the world today is two dual processes. So the old world order, which is not fit for this age, it's from a previous age, and it's not adequate for this age, it's disintegrating. So governments all over the world are failing. The educational system is failing. You know, you see it. You see all that, you mentioned the violence. You know, for example, the country of Mali was taken over by jihadists. Italy's government just basically the prime minister resigned. The UK, the prime minister resigned. This is happening all over the world. There's a lot. Governments are failing. They're not able to do the job. So many systems are failing, and the reason they're failing is, I think our medical systems are failing. You name it. Our food systems are going to fail as well. We're just at the beginning of that. We're not able to deal with climate change. And if you look at in my opinion, the morality of this country and other places is terrible and getting worse. And you know, the idea, we're becoming very much hedonistic, which is not how God, I think, wants us to be. I think He wants us to be good. And it's actually, it's interesting because that's literally the road to perdition, the road to hell. We are supposed to love each other. We're supposed to be working in the service of humanity. True joy, true heaven, according to Baha'u'llah, is reunion with God. And hell is reunion with yourself, your selfish desires. And yet in this country, we focus on selfish desires. This is part of the disintegration. And what we need to do is really lean into the other parts. Because what's happening simultaneously is a new world order is coming up. Now that's, in some quarters, that's a bad word, but I always say I'm always very scared of the new world order, which is, of course, you know, the new world order is really scary. It's got warring governments, you have nuclear weapons, they hate each other, they're corrupt. There's corruption, there's superstition, there's ancient tradition that's no longer, oh wait, I'm sorry, that's the current world order, that's the scary one. The new world order would be Christ returning, as promised, and bringing this love and this peace to unify humanity. That's the true new world order, and that's what's rising now. All these ideas that Baha'u'llah was teaching us, equality of women, the oneness of race, the oneness of nation, the oneness of religion, harmony between religion and science, which is a very important thing. These things, which were radical ideas in the mid-1800s, these are rising up, and that's the new world order. That's the integration. That's the new world coming up, and that's the world that we're going to live in. But the old trees, like if you look at the forest, the old trees that are dying, dead and dying, need to fall. That's the loud noise. But meanwhile, you don't see the saplings rising up. So that's the rising up, and that's the beautiful thing. And so Baha'is will tell you sometimes. You know, my wife has told me, she said, "You're a pessimist." I said, "No," because I described the disintegration. I said, "No, that doesn't bother me. It has to happen." As I'm smiling as I'm saying it, because the disintegration in me is a good thing, because I'm looking at the hope. I'm looking at this hope, and I know that it ends well. So Baha'is, even though we have realized that the world is disintegrating, Baha'is are very hopeful because we've been told by Baha'u'llah that this is part of the necessary thing that has to happen in order for the new to rise up and for us to really achieve something that humanity's never achieved, which is world peace. This civilization that we're headed into is the greatest civilization in the history of humanity. And the Baha'i writings say it's so great that even we Baha'is, who have read the writings, can't visualize it now. That's how great it is.
And I think our task is to work together toward that, right? And because it's not about, I love Jesus just as much as I love Muhammad, as much as I love Baha'u'llah, because it's all one faith, it's one word. And so therefore, to work together with anyone who is interested in advancing humanity versus falling into the troubles of the old world order, if we can work together at showing love, at thinking about what's best for our neighbor, our community, and maybe even the world, like even thinking that whatever I'm doing here is like a ripple effect around the world. So this idea that I have to be thinking that what I'm doing perhaps will benefit others beyond the borders of my neighborhood, my city, my county, my state, my country, that somehow it will help the larger part of the world and not cause damage to the larger part of the world. So being sensitive to the reality that cultures are changing.
And if you were to follow Abdul-Baha's example, even working with those who aren't that nice to us. So Abdul-Baha had a man who was mean to him for over 20 years. He was a Muslim cleric, and he was poor. Abdul-Baha would give him food and clothing for over 20 years, and the man wouldn't even look at Abdul-Baha. And finally, after over 20, I think it was 24 years, he looked at him and saw he was being kind to him, and it broke the ice. And he kind of couldn't believe that Abdul-Baha was being kind to him, and then he started a conversation, and they became friends. So it broke down. It took 24 years of patience. I'm not Abdul-Baha. I don't know if I'd have lasted that long. But that's a goal for all of us. Maybe we could last 2 years, maybe it could last 3 years, maybe it could last 10 minutes.
Yeah.
But however long we can be kind to everybody, and that kindness and that love that we can show to every human being, our job as human beings is to love everybody. Everybody we meet, shower them with love.
Be one person add to another person, they
course.
will multiply.
That's exactly right. The starting with oneness, even when you're fighting racism, I have two foundations. One foundation is Baha'i inspired, one is not. One foundation, we fought racism from the idea of oneness. And with things, Baha'i concept like confrontation, where the egos went outside the room. And when we had an idea, we shared the ideas. And we fought racism with the understanding that we're going to do this side by side, white, black, brown, as one human family, fighting for justice for all of us. And the other foundation became very much, there were people who basically said, I know what the solution is, you don't, shut up. And there was no more conversation. And it became very divisive. We had the same, all of us in the foundation had agreed that we wanted to fight racism, but for some people it was my way or the highway. We didn't have the guidance, and you really need, what it showed me, you need the guidance, and everything has to come with that guidance. Because if you move away from it, we're not smart enough to get along. It doesn't work. You really need that guidance and that reminder, constant reminder that we're one human family. And it has to be deep in your heart, and the deeper it is in your heart, the better.
Yeah.
Our hearts, I should say. Not your heart, but our hearts.
We started to hear about, one world and about equality and everything just recently, and with the events of like the King and a lot of things that happened in the early race movements, and we say that we'll believe in one world. Back then, 70s, 80s, yeah, we were all one world. That's just started to happen now. It's been now we are confronted with that question, and we, the recent events with the race movements and whatever, the abortion issue, this issue, that issue. We're examining the things that we commonly accepted before as it's like human rights and whatever. But now we're really experiencing, what it really means to have that idea. So sometimes we have something, or when we blindly accept something, we don't really experience it, we don't really understand it as much. And it's like, it's true with anything, you know, once you have something, you don't really realize until it's taken away from you, and then you say, oh, I missed that, and, you know, and you learn to appreciate it even more.
Well, your capacity grows, right? Your ability to express it not just in words, but through deeds and action, in collaboration with others, changes. And that's really one of the things I think that we've seen really starting to really happen a lot in the world, is that people are actually exploring, working to it together, and where patience prevails,
Well, there's a
it seems to
dichotomy.
be.
There's more division and there's more unity at the same time. So there's a lot of really bad partisan politics, and it's gotten much worse. At the same time, simultaneously, there's people working for unity on a much larger scale. And so what you see is a divisive action, a unified action. And actually, if you look closely, the unity is growing faster, but the division is in the news.
Right, exactly. Our interfaith groups, for instance, is growing. You know, we're interfaith in Poway right now. We have like 25 member organizations and groups, and we all accept the same beliefs. We want to create unity. So we talk about shared interests, and we talk about what this world needs and how we can all cooperate together. How one person, for instance, who is Christian, says that the first time that they heard what Hinduism says about the world and about unity, they said, "Oh, I must be Hindu because I believe in that."
What's the difference between Christ and Krishna in Greek? Because Christ is a Greek word. What's the difference between Christ and Krishna in Greek? Nothing. Same. The
It
Greek,
should be the same, probably.
it is the same word.
We should be in all faiths.
Christ is Christ.
Yeah.
And so we get so tagged on the labels, you know, national labels, religious labels. We forget about oneness. If we just take a deep breath and pull ourselves out of the hatred and division we've been taught, and we realize the obvious oneness of humanity, it's there, it's right there in front of you. You just have to take a deep breath and understand it.
And sometimes really work hard to change old behaviors.
Yeah, well, we have to root the prejudice from our hearts to pull it out. The change has to be in our hearts. We can't change our heads until we change our hearts.
But with science, we know that we can study and we can read and we can learn and we can express and then we can do, and all of that leads to changing in our heart. And the change in our heart leads us to study, to educate ourselves, to express, to act, and that changes and transforms the heart even further. Conversation about the transformation of the world from God's perspective, from the Word of God, because that's really what you brought to us.
Well, I think the Word of God is supposed to transform the world and individual. You know, religion is for the individual and collective salvation of humanity. It is thought by most people today to be about individual salvation. But religion has always been about individual and collective salvation. This is the golden ages, that's the collective salvation. And so what's happening is, another way to look at it is, God has been giving us this ever-widening band of unity in every age. In this age, it was this wide, and then as humanity grows in capacity, the spread of the unity will grow. And this is the first age where the unity is going to go over the entire globe. And that's the really cool thing to think about, is that this unity that was once confined to the Persian Empire, the greatest empire of its age, or the Maurya Empire, the greatest empire of its age, or the Byzantine Empire, or the first caliphate, is now going to go all around the globe, and will be one. This is the age of maturity. So that's the other thing to say, that this is the age of maturity of humanity. We've come through our childhood, and now it's time for us to act like adults.
But you know, humanity doesn't go right from childhood to adults like that.
No, we're in the adolescent stage. But we're headed to adulthood, hopefully quickly. Because we have some very big weapons we need to not fire at each other.